Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and the correct pronunciation of the word Sehnsucht. At a corner table by the fire are three people. One of them is puzzling through other terms like saudade, hereth, and galmang. And that's me, Matthew Mellema. And welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with the Christian imagination. All right, let me take you all back in time. All the way back to... Wait, was it really 2015? Well, regardless, this was still the earlier days of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. I was a brand new member, and at one of my first meetings, the handful of other members were reading passages from some of their writing. Now, a standout passage came from a writer who had a blog at the time, one that focused on the theme of home. Now, the passage was absolutely fantastic, and I really admired her focus on that theme. But I did wonder, how much could she really write about that theme of home? Well, it turns out she could write at least one entire book on the subject. Here is what the back cover has to say. That sudden yearning you feel when you see a sunset, that pang of longing you sense deep in your bones when you attend a funeral or even gaze at a poignant piece of art, those experiences that sting you to attention in moments of beauty, peace, or sorrow, the ones you can sense are offering you a twinkling, piercing hint of heaven. Are these meant to do more than point you to eternity? What if they could enable you to live more fully on the way there? This book, which is just recently out, and which, as you can guess from my intro, I'm incredibly excited about, is called This Homeward Ache, How Our Yearning for the Life to Come Spurs on Our Life Today. And the author, Amy Beck-Lee, is joining us at the pub table right now. Amy, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. And I have absolutely no memory of that 2015 piece on home.
Well, I mean, it stuck with me, so, mission accomplished, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but so. Was it really that long? Did I do the math right?
I think that sounds about right to me, yeah. Yeah, wow.
So, listeners to the podcast, Amy is a frequent guest on the show. I was saying beforehand that if we should get like blazers or something after a certain number of guest appearances, because she would have it. And yes, Amy, she's been writing really great stuff for Anselm, where she's been a member of the Arts Guild for, years and years and years. Even longer than me, right? I'm one of the originals now.
Think.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so me and Amy, we're some of the, I was going to say OGs, but is that something people say anymore? I'm too
the
old.
wrong person to ask.
Anyway, but you also do some writing for the Rabbit Room, the Cultivating Project. So you've been writing for a lot of different sources, and I want to talk a lot about this particular one. But first, we have a very special co-host, my wife, Danielle Mellema. How are you, sweetie?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to be back on the podcast and to be here with you, Amy.
Yeah, so let's start with the basics. Amy Beck-Lee, what is your book about?
Oh. It is about what C.S. Lewis called the inconsolable longing. And there are two parts to the book. And the first part talks about, in a linear narrative, it talks about my personal experience of encountering that longing in various stages throughout my life, and tracing it back to really what I think Ecclesiastes says about God setting eternity in the hearts of man. And then the second part is a collection of essays about how that longing and learning how to live with it has affected and filled out, I guess I would say, different aspects of my life.
Mm-hmm. So I want to obviously talk about both of those aspects, but first off, the sort of two-tier, right? Like eternity in our hearts, tier 1, then tier 2, how does that affect our life now? Did you go into this book project with those two tiers, or did those sort of evolve as you started writing it?
I think the initial plan that I had was to do 3 parts, actually, because I was thinking of 3, I don't know if they'd be distinct audiences, but 3 types of readers, I guess. And the first type was people who have encountered this type of yearning, but have no name for it. And they're just starting, they would just resonate, I guess, with anybody who had a similar story to offer. And so for that first group, I think my hope was just to help them begin to identify it. And then the second group was more for the people who knew that it may have a connection to the gospel, to the Christian story, but wanted to know kind of more of how it's woven throughout church history, what its significance is that we can find about it in Scripture. And then the third group was for people who are intimately acquainted with this longing, but didn't know what to do with it, and wanted to know if there was a way to live more fully with it, I guess I would say. And so anyway, because of those 3 groups that I had in mind, initially I had 3 parts in mind, but I think I guess it was the first and second group, or the first and second part, that kind of merged to become that one linear narrative where I was hoping to share more of the theological connections and the things that I'd learned from other scholars and writers over time. Yeah, so that's how it ended up to be 2 parts.
Right.
Yeah.
I always love looking behind the curtain with these evolving book
Well, that's
projects.
the first time I've been asked that question, actually.
Yes.
So, yeah.
That's wonderful. I would love to hear more about your transition from writing about this frequently in blog posts or sharing shorter writings with friends to it becoming a book. Like, how was that seed planted for you? And what helped you realize that this was maybe the best way to communicate this message?
Yeah. Oh, this is fun to trace the history, because you will both know, I think, all the people that I would mention. But when I came into the Anselm Society X number of years ago, right? I guess, it's that was
primordial days of Anselm.
when time gets hazy. I think I didn't really have any long-term projects in mind then, and I think the first piece that I remember reading for an Anselm pub night was about play, like how do you play in a broken world, and then maybe the one after that was more about home. So maybe that's the one I'm thinking of, but now. But I think it was in the Progression of the Imagination Redeemed conferences. I got to give a talk for the 2018 one, I think. And that was when I think I took this topic and I decided to delve into it a bit further. And that was because I was starting to meet people in the Anselm Society and also read things, I think, at that point in the Rabbit Room, where people were talking about the inconsolable longing and Sehnsucht and the things that had brought them to Christ. And then I gave that talk. I still didn't have, I think, a long-term idea out of that. And then at some point, I think I overheard, or it was online, someone asking, "What are you supposed to do with this?" And I couldn't get that question out of my head. And I think that it just started reverberating in my mind. And I thought, well, I could tell you stories. I mean, I'm just one person, and all I've got are the stories that I've lived. But maybe it would be worth putting that in a book and investigating it along the way, because I think even at that point, I didn't have half of what shows up in this book. But it was that desire to maybe write something that could encourage somebody, because it can be such a debilitating thing. It's a unique longing, I think, that it can leave you feeling paralyzed, and you almost don't know what to do in its wake. So if I could write something that would encourage somebody to pick up and go on, or to use what was happening in that moment to lay themselves more open to God, that became the seed of a hope. And then it was interesting from there, because Maybe I brought it up at the Guild. I don't know. That dream of the idea, and then somewhere around maybe during the pandemic, there was a lot of time to think, and I think I started to piece things together then. So I
picture you like staring out a window, like holding a pen up to your chin, just like
Maybe I probably would have looked more like I was just zoning out on the garden. But so I think I started collecting these pieces back in 2017, maybe even 2016. But it was after the pandemic. No, that's not true. Every year, I think it just grew a little bit more, but it was during the pandemic and maybe in 2020, 2021, when I actually started to put a proposal together. And then it became not a game exactly, but a step-by-step process of just feeling like the Lord was asking me to do the next step, but without knowing what the outcome might be. That the next step was to work on the book proposal and finish it, and then to try to find an agent for it. And if that didn't work, that was okay, but at least the thing that I was being asked to do was just the next thing. So it just became this dance almost of one step, and following his lead, I guess. And then, I mean, no one is more surprised that we are here right now than I am, really.
So let's talk a little bit about this longing. This what was that German word that I mispronounced?
Oh. So, do you remember James Clapper in the Guild? His wife is German, and she taught me how to say it. Okay. And I don't know that I have the guttural strength for it, but it's Sehnsucht.
Sehnsucht.
Wow, that's an excellent
To any listeners in Germany, I'm deeply sorry. I realize I likely offended you. Believe it or not, I'm trying my hardest. Okay. So, let's talk a little bit more about the history here. Because, I think for a lot of us, we probably first encountered this idea being like written about in C.S. Lewis, because he wrote a lot about it. But from your intro, it sounds like there are a lot of other Christian thinkers and other thinkers through the ages have given this a lot of thought. So what did you learn sort of delving deeper into the history of this concept?
Yeah, well, it was an interesting rabbit trail, and I wish I knew more, I guess. But Sehnsucht, C.S. Lewis writes about as the term that he landed on, but he got that term from the German Romantics. And so when he calls himself a votary of the blue flower, he's also referring to, I forget the author's name, but a work by Novalis about a man who has a dream about a blue flower. And anyway, so around that movement, I don't know that the word itself arose from that time, but that I think is when it came into prominence, meaning, this longing for a place that you can't get to, maybe you have never gotten to, maybe that isn't accessible to you at all. And I think as I looked more into that longing and started recognizing different places where it was spoken of, I think I pull a lot from, I'm going to botch his name too, so my apologies, but it's a Swedish theologian named Owe Wickström, who wrote a book called The Icon in My Pocket, I believe. And he went on a pilgrimage. It's a fascinating book because he goes on a pilgrimage through Europe asking people about it, trying to find different, and he meets such interesting people who have different insights into where the longing comes from. But there does seem to be a general consensus that it comes from our status as fallen beings, being conscious of the degree of our separation from the perfection that we feel like we know, or the wholeness that we know that we were made for. So he had some things to say about that. I think the most interesting trail actually was, I think that book also helped me to hone in on it, but this word compunctio that was used by Gregory the Great to talk about the different kinds of compunction that we feel, this piercing feeling. And he talked about 4 different kinds. And yeah. It's probably going to slip my mind. All of these different distinctions, but one of them is that longing for what is to be and what has not come to pass yet. So all of that, to me, I think kind of fits into the same landscape.
All right, and as you're speaking, I'm making a note, Gregory the Great, cum punctio. So while I'm making that note for a further rabbit trail that I will go down, I will turn it over to my lovely wife.
Thank you. I think it's interesting to see how throughout history people have come to this longing from so many different angles. And I wonder, for you, how did you decide on the particular angle and perspective you would take in your book? Did that kind of flow fairly naturally for you? Did it take some decision making? What moved you to explore this concept in the way that you did?
It's interesting because that got me thinking, sweetie, because you decided at one point to write a book, a whole book, about a longing that is inexpressible. That's quite the undertaking.
I agree. I agree. I think that's been one of the things that I'm most grateful for in the feedback that I've been getting, that something's resonating with some people. And I think, that just makes me grateful that I didn't entirely miss the mark. So I'm sorry, what was your question?
I was just sort of intercepting Danielle's question. So she had a question, I just piggybacked on it.
Okay.
But the original question before I piggybacked was how you decided to go about taking the angle on that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I guess in one sense, I don't know that there is another take that I could have had, or another mode of storytelling that I could have. I mean, I think in the process of working through the book, sometimes I wondered if I should skew more academic or, or go more cerebrally into things. But it's, I think it was maybe the nature of the ache. I don't know. It felt almost like sacrilege to try to coldly dissect it, if that makes sense.
It would be weird, yeah.
Yes.
And there's a bit in the book about something that Clyde Kilby says, and he says when you've got a bird and you're trying to figure out what a bird is, and you put it and you lay it dead on a table, you've already lost a great percentage of what makes a bird, and what you've got in front of you is not a bird; it's a specimen. And I was talking to my husband about this the other day, and I was saying, that's I've got this niggling thought in my head sometimes that maybe I did just dissect it. Am I not trying to talk about it? And am I trying to get into the details about it? And then I thought, but what is the difference? There feels like there is a difference between, and this is the best distinction I could come to. There's the kind of dissection that a person in a lab will do. That's the kind of study that somebody in a lab trying to figure out how a bird works will do. Then there's the kind of study that a bird watcher does, where you're seeing the thing in motion. You don't want to kill it and you don't want to take it apart, but you're aware that there's so much in the interaction of, muscle and feather and birdness and a mystery at the heart of it all, because what is it that actually gives life to a bird? I think that's what I wanted to do with the book. I didn't want to pick it apart because that felt like I'd be killing something in the process. But I did want, the prayer was really to maybe have the book itself be a conduit for somebody to feel that ache. And that is, I still feel like that's something that's completely up to the Lord with each individual reader. But in terms of telling the personal stories, I felt like out of the books that I had read on a Homeward Longing, that was the thing I was missing. I was, sitting on the edge of my seat anytime people who wrote about this got to the intersection of how does this meet the rubber of your daily road. But often that was just kind of a blip, in a chapter. And a lot of them really wanted to drive the point home that the whole thing that this is pointing to is Jesus and his death and resurrection, and I totally agree. But I didn't know how to take it, down to everyday reality living with an awareness of eternity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I think you did it really beautifully, and it was such a joy to read.
I'm grateful to hear that.
Thank
you.
Absolutely. The thing that comes to mind for me in just like the tenderness of trying to explore a topic without dissecting it is similar to being a bird watcher versus someone who has a bird to dissect in a lab. Is the bird is living, and I think similarly, like, we have like a living God that we are like exploring in this as well. Like, it's a very dynamic process. One of our kids asked me the other day a question I think a lot of kids have, I think a lot of adults have, is like, I want to know God, but how can I know him if I can't see him? And I think there's a lot of ways you can answer that, and some like specifics you can get into, practices to approach it. But I told them that the thing that I want you to remember in this question more than anything else is that we can know God because God wants to be known by us. And he reveals himself to us. And so even as we try to, puzzle together, like, what does it mean to know God? I think it's good to remember that we have a knowable God. And I think that's part of what is able to create this longing and this ache in us, because God can be known and he reveals himself to us. And so we are made with the ability to connect to his longing for us to know him. And
absolutely.
I think you point to that in so many beautiful ways as well, like weaving personal narrative with scripture that has really resonated with you, like on this journey to know God in your everyday life, in the places where you've experienced this longing. And I think anyone who reads it, I think will be inspired to examine their own lives, because you don't give a lot of specific instruction to others, like here's how you must go about this.
Here's how to experience the inexpressible longing.
Yes.
Step 1, sit on a rock.
It's actually
Step
not
2,
as
observe
hard.
the sunset.
Yes,
Oh, goodness. That's just like a dagger through the heart.
Yes. I think you do a great job, though, of making it seem possible without telling someone else how they ought to go about doing that, which I think in the long run could bear some really wonderful fruit. I think it almost creates a longing in the reader to examine that longing more deeply, and to believe that it could there could be a response to it, not just someday when everything is made new, but right now as well. It was beautiful.
Thank you so much. I hope so. I hope that is where it leads. And I do remember I tried very consciously to not make it a, you've probably noticed the structure, but, begin with a personal anecdote, have a generalized study, and then have the application, paragraphs at the end.
I've attempted the same thing a time or two, yes.
But I don't know if it was instinctive. I know there was a long thought process, but that was something that I found myself shying away from. So I knew that I didn't. I'm not saying that there isn't room for books in the market like that. And just like I was mentioning with the earlier books that are very explicit in tying it to the gospel, I strongly believe that those books are needed. I just felt like this particular one, because of the subject and because of the people that I was trying to reach, needed to be personal, and it needed to stay vulnerable. And if I was going to say we at any point in the book, I had to earn it. Mm-hmm. And I was really conscious of that. Yeah.
So Sweetie, I promise I'm going somewhere with this, okay?
I can't wait to
This
hear what comes
conversation
next.
has got me thinking about Plato versus Aristotle. Okay, so folks who know more about philosophy than me, I'm about to do some broad overgeneralizations that veer into the inaccurate, so just know.
Here we go.
As it's come down to us, Plato is all about the universals, right? Like in the School of Athens by Raphael, he has his one finger pointed to the heavens, right? So there's the universe of perfect forms, so we sort of start there and work from there. Whereas Aristotle, he has his fingers, spread out, pointed down toward the earth, where it's the particulars, where we look at the particulars and reasoning from them, we can learn more about the universals. I have this theory that a lot of folks with an artistic bent, we are by disposition, if not by, philosophy, we are Aristotelians. We try to find the universals by looking at specific examples out in the wild. Like you said, we're bird watchers, Amy. So it's not, I'm going to write a treatise on the 5 universal qualities of the ineffable longing. It's, here's this particular experience I had of it. Right? So here's one experience I had here. Here's a particular experience here. And using these different particulars, maybe we can learn something about it more broadly speaking. So that whole wind-up is to ask this rather straightforward question, hopefully. Using all the different anecdotes that you had of this experience, do you feel you were able to gain any universal insights that you feel more broadly after? Or do you think it's just one of those things where here's an instance, here's an instance, here's an instance?
This is a fascinating question. I think all the more fascinating because I've just realized after writing the book that I want to go down a few more rabbit trails after writing this book. So the human heart being what it is, I think we are liable to, well, I should start by saying we are capable of great compassion and insight and feeling the depth of our humanity and empathizing with other people. I think we are also capable of great delusions or going off into, paths that lead to things that seem like truth that aren't truth. And so when you're talking about particulars and universalities and what that makes me think of actually is a list that I have of things that have made me cry that I had to go back to write this book because I still haven't figured out half of the things on that list. But I'm finding this great adventure in going through item by item. I think if you do it with the foundations of Scripture in mind, that those things are enough of a pathway light, I guess, or a lamp along the way to help you begin to see what is at the heart of that grief or longing or joy that's catching you and making you weep. And I think that's a, fascinating question because I think that is how I operate in some ways, that the effect of something hits before I know what it is and where it's coming from. But I do believe that the answer to it is in Scripture and that it has been demonstrated in the lives of believers and in the best stories that we know. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I do see that pattern in my own life too.
Yeah, so we're running a little low on time, so let's get into your what to do with it portion of the book, right? So let me take you and the listeners on my own journey through a particular instance. Okay, let's go back. I'm 17 years old. It's summer before my senior year of high school. I had been reading for school The Once and Future King by T.H. White. Love the book. And it was a particularly poignant section that I had been reading. And Once Future King is about it's a retelling, kind of whimsical retelling of King Arthur, Camelot, the knights, and all this. So I have King Arthur and his knights, sort of dancing around my subconscious. I'm 17. My dad makes me do this project with him because our fence had blown down in the back. So I'm out digging a fence. It's evening. I look up at the sunset, like this white gold sunset right above the mountains. And all of it together, me being 17, having the King Arthur stories in my head, this white gold sunset over the mountains, It was all so beautiful and powerful that it made me feel miserable.
Wow.
And I didn't know what to do with it. It was just like, what is happening? I'm wasting everything. What's going on? So,
Okay,
Amy.
I need you to describe what you mean by miserable.
Oh, well, I felt like there's something beautiful in just golden in beyond up there, you know, gestures toward the heavens in general that I was missing out on.
Huh.
So, picture 17-year-old Matt sort of hunched over in a ditch that I'd been digging. What would you, Amy Beckley, based on what you were writing in this book, what would you tell that poor 17-year-old?
Good gracious. I think I would stand there with you and ask what you were seeing. And hopefully be overtaken by the same. I love that you shared that. That was the question that I wanted to ask both of you, actually. I don't know if you have an instance that you remember from your life, Danielle.
Oh, man. That's such a good question. There are several. I think for a lot of things from childhood, it's not really until just the last few years that I've been able to kind of put words to like, oh, like that's what I was experiencing. So certainly this isn't how I would have articulated it as a child. But on occasion, when we would spend the night with my grandparents on a weekend, we would go to church with them on a Sunday instead of to our home church that my family attended. And it's an old country church in Southwest Missouri that has been, portions of the building at least, have been standing since before the Civil War. And along the church, next to the churchyard, is this old graveyard. Some of the stones are so covered in moss you can barely even read the dates on them. And I remember this moment as a little girl, sitting along the old fence post waiting for the church bells to ring for us to go inside, and just looking out over the graveyard, and then hearing the church bells ring to call us all into worship, and just having this sense of awe, this sense that, I mean, I had to have been like 5. I was very young. Just a sense of awe, a sense of like my life being caught up in something very good with all these people around me milling about, also, you know, walking up the old stone steps into the church. And then, of course, because I was 5, I soon after, it's like, oh, Grandma's calling me in. I better get off this fence post, and I walk inside. But like for that moment, it felt, I don't know, it just felt very profound. It was like a moment that kind of wrapped around me in some ways. And I think for me, there may be earlier instances than that, but that's like the kind of one of the first ones that really come to mind as far as like chronologically, when I experienced that sense of a longing that I couldn't really put a name to. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Here, listeners, is the true talent of Amy Beckley. She has turned the interview tables on us completely.
It's good to be among friends.
Well,
It helps.
So, like I said, we are running low on time. But one final question, just because I'm sure a lot of listeners are wondering, since this is a podcast about stories, are there any stories, whether it's books, movies, maybe it's other works of art, that either particularly evoke this for you, or that you think capture this attitude particularly well?
I think so. I think there's 2 dimensions to that. I think there are certain stories that I almost regard as thin places. Like I will go back and revisit them because they have scenes or dialogue or something, the same way I would do with songs. that draw me back into that. And then there are those moments where you go back and you look for it and you're reading that passage and you're like, it's just not hitting the same way. And I think those are the moments that help me to realize it's a pure act of grace, I think, when those moments happen. And it's not something that you can come up with a recipe for. It's not even the kind of thing that you can say, you can grab your husband or your friend and sit them down and say, listen, this is going to be amazing, because sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. And I feel like that's really the grace in it, though, because if we could conjure it up, who knows what we would do with it, but it wouldn't be something that we allowed to lead us to the Lord over and over again. So, but anyway, having said that, there are some favorite things where I feel like that happens more often than not. And The Lord of the Rings is a big one for me. You can probably tell from the book. A lot of C.S. Lewis's writings are like that. I'm sorry, was that your question?
It was.
I just wanted to make sure. There are poems that come to mind and songs, and I've listed out a lot of these in chapter 15. But I think sometimes it's surprising. I mean, you guys will know this from being parents of young kids, but sometimes it's things like watching a Disney movie with them for the 20th time and something suddenly hits me like, I never noticed that before. And how did I know? Why is it making me cry? And obviously there are a lot of tears involved in this whole discovery process, if you haven't guessed by now, for me at least. But actually, I'm starting to write a column for Cultivating magazine on this. I'm calling it The Kingdom in Our Midst, and just talking about the, not the high art, but what I call the low art moments where you're just kind of hit between the eyes by like a Disney movie or a children's literature passage that you were reading to your kids. So, yeah, there are places and characters and settings that I love for what they bring, but I'm also really surprised by it, and I'm grateful for that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, once again, listeners, the book is called This Homeward Ache, How Our Yearning for the Life to Come Spurs on Our Life Today. Author, Amy Beck Lee. Let me spell that for you all for the search engine optimization. So Amy, Beck is B-A-I-K, and Lee is L-E-E. This Homeward Ache. Amy, where can we find you? Where can we find your writing?
You can find me online at amybeckley.com, and then for social media, I guess I'm probably most active on Instagram under Amy Beckley.
All right. Well, thank you once again. And listeners, as you can probably tell, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have a few spare seconds right now, please rate and review this show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.